Hey everybody, this is a piece from workerscontrol.net. It's by David Adam. It's titled Marx's Critique of Socialist Labor Money Schemes and the Myth of Council Communism's Proudhonism. And the subtitle, or the little description, just says, dismantling the myth that the council communist tradition actually advocated a self-managed capitalist economy rather than a truly communist one. Some left theorists have claimed that the council communist tradition actually advocated a self-managed capitalist economy rather than a truly communist one. This essay aims to expose and dismantle that myth by examining some writings of council communists, particularly of the Dutch group of International Communists and Antonie Pannekoek, and comparing them with Karl Marx's own writings on post-capitalist labor time accounting. Through this process, I hope to show that the myth about council communism is fundamentally based on a misrepresentation of Marx's stance on these issues. In order to understand the similarities and revolutionary perspectives of Marx's and council communists' analyses, it is necessary to dispel the myths about Marx's own views, and to emphasize his distinction between measurement of labor under capitalism by, quote, value, end quote, and measurement of socialist, quote, directly social labor, end quote, by time. Accordingly, much of the essay will focus on Marx. It is clear that self-management was a primary concern of the council communists. As Pannekoek put it in 1952, quote, workers' councils does not designate a form of organization whose lines are fixed once and for all, and which requires only the subsequent elaboration of the details. It is concerned with a principle, the principle of the workers' self-management of enterprises and of production, end quote. Some critics contend that the theory of worker self-management advocated by Pannekoek and others, by ignoring the specific content of communist social relations, in fact perpetuates capitalist social relations. The contention that the council communist advocated capitalist forms is tied to the question of labor certificates, or vouchers, an idea that has a long history in the socialist movement. Gilles Dauvé's 1969 critique of the council communist tradition in Leninism and the Ultra-Left seems to be an important point of reference for a modern tendency that theorizes revolutionary transformation as, quote, communization, and questions the traditional Marxist notion of a revolutionary transitional period. Dauvé rejects the idea of labor certificates and of labor time accounting as part of a critique of any notion of a socialist, quote, management of the economy, end quote. The representatives of the council communist tradition, Dauvé asserts in a follow-up essay, quote, called Notes on Trotsky, Pannekoek, and Bordiga, were wrong to look for a rational accounting system in labor time, end quote. Dauvé claims that Marx himself rejected labor time accounting and vouchers at the beginning of the Grundrisse. One significant reason to be skeptical about Dauvé's claim is the fact that Marx proposed just such a system of labor time vouchers as part of the first phase of communism in his critique of the Gotha program, written after the Grundrisse. It is true that Marx was extremely critical of the idea of, quote, labor money, which he associated with the Ricardian socialist and the Proudhonists. Yet, in 1875, he offers support to the idea of tying consumption to work hours through, quote, certificates. Was Marx going back on his previous position? Was he assuming the persistence of the law of value in a communist society? This essay will argue that Marx did neither of these things, and that his remarks in the critique of the Gotha program and the council communist elaboration of this theme, whatever its flaws, are consistent with his critique of, quote, labor money, end quote. This demonstration will reveal Dauvé's use of Marx's theory to rest on a misunderstanding. While Dauvé's critique of the council communist attitude towards political parties will be unaffected, his influential critique of, quote, self-management, end quote, will be significantly weakened. This is just a side thought because yesterday I read Myth of the Transitional Society by Adam Buick, and he refers to this advocacy of the certificates, the labor certificates of Marx in the Critique of the Gotha Program. Adam Buick argues that they were merely a suggestion. So I don't know. Between suggestion and advocacy, what is that? And would there be, if you think of a higher and lower phase of communism, in terms of the lower phase still characterizing some sense of quid pro quo between producers and society, insofar as you give and then you get from each according to your ability, to each from each according to their work, to each according to their work. From each according to their ability to each according to their work, and from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Is there some kind of, in the development between those lower and higher phases, would the quid pro quo level, the quid pro quo level would be weeded out? This is just a thought. I'm just thinking out loud, so sorry, forgive me. But there probably would be, in a situation of communist possibility, there would be probably some transition between, not in a formal stage in a sense, but that balance of what are you still operating on a quid pro quo labor certificate kind of basis, and one where consumption goods are freely taken by individuals. There's probably be some degree of tension between those principles that would have to be sorted out over time, and with the goal being the latter, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. But sorry, just thinking out loud. Marx's Gotha critique. First, we must briefly review what Marx wrote in his critique of the Gotha program regarding the first phase of communism. There are three more or less distinct periods described by Marx which are often confused. There is a period of revolutionary transformation, a first phase of communist society, and a higher phase of communist society. Within the context of discussing these societal shifts, quote, socialism, end quote, is never described by Marx as a distinct phase, as he did not differentiate between the concept of socialist society and communist society. The terms were interchangeable for Marx. Nonetheless, Marx divides socialism or communism into two phases, before any type of communist society comes into existence. Marx writes of a necessary, quote, revolutionary transformation, end quote. Quote, between capitalist and communist society, there is a period of revolutionary transformation of one into the other. There is also correspondingly a period of political transition, in which the state can be nothing else but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Although described at an earlier point in the critique, the two phases of communist society chronologically follow this transformation of capitalism into communism. The first phase of communist society ties individual consumption to hours worked, while the higher phase of communist society functions in accord with the principle, quote, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, end quote. Marx describes the first phase of communism as, quote, communist society, not as communist society is developed on communist society's own foundations, but on the contrary, as communist society emerges from capitalist society, end quote. In this first phase of communism, the worker, quote, gets from society a receipt that he has contributed such and such an amount of labor, after deduction of labor for common reserves, and withdrawals from society's stores of the means of consumption, an equal amount costed in labor terms, end quote. While Marx discusses this form of society as still marked by its emergence from capitalism, and therefore inadequate in certain aspects, this lower phase of communism is nonetheless described as communism, a society that has dispensed with the state, value, and the institution of wage labor. Right from the first phase of communist society, labor must be socially distributed for the purpose of satisfying human needs. By contrast, the post-festum social planning of capitalism requires that the human labor expended on the products of individual capitals be evaluated against the norm of socially necessary labor time. This returning more or less of society's labor time in the form of money then was set in motion by any given capital. In a capitalist society, the, quote, active norm, end quote, of socially necessary labor time operates through competition to discipline the capitalist producers. In the first phase of communist society, remuneration is tied to labor performed, but the labor of the individual producer is recognized directly through the process of production as a contribution to the material well-being of society. The labor expended on products does not, in Marx's words, quote, appear any more as the value of these products, one of the material properties that they possess, because now, in contrast to capitalist society, the labor of individuals will no longer be a constituent part of the total labor in a roundabout way, but will be part of it directly, end quote. The mystery of the value form stems from the fact that capitalism is a, quote, social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man, instead of the opposite, end quote. The crucial distinction for Marx between capitalist society and communist society is this. The workers are no longer dominated by their alienated labor in the form of capital, since workers have brought production under their collective control. This destroys the fetishistic value form of the product of labor. As Marx put it in Capital, quote, the religious reflections of the real world can, in any case, vanish only when the practical relations of everyday life between man and man and nature, generally present themselves to him in a transparent and rational form. The veil is not removed from the countenance of the social life process, i.e., the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men, and stands under their conscious and planned control, end quote. As we shall see, in Dauvé's critique of labor time accounting, this is not the fundamental distinction between capitalist and communist forms of society. He instead characterizes a conscious measuring of He instead characterizes a conscious measuring of average labor times as constitutive of the capitalist value relation. He being Dauvé. Sorry, I gotta make a phone call, so there'll be some noise. The famous critique of, quote, councilism, end quote. Dauvé's seminal critique of the council communist tradition, laid out in the essay Leninism and the Ultraleft, condemns the council communist theory of workers' self-management for reproducing capitalist relations of production. In another essay entitled Notes on Trotsky, Pannekoek, and Bordiga, the Italian left communist Amadeo Bordiga is viewed as a sort of corrective to the Dutch-German left's ideology of self-management, But what exactly needs to be corrected? What is it about self-management that is capitalist? It is not democratic control of production per se, but rather the assumed existence of certain social relations within the self-managed economy envisaged by the Council Communists. Dauvé writes, quote, the theory of the management of society the theory of the management of society through workers' councils does not take the dynamics of capitalism into account. It retains all the categories and characteristics of capitalism: wage labor, law of value, exchange. The sort of socialism it proposes is nothing other than capitalism, democratically managed by the workers, end quote. This central claim is simply false. But what is Dauvé even referring to? While he has a number of footnotes citing Marx's work, he cites no Council Communist text that would validate his claims. Here we must review a bit of history. The Dutch Council Communists had, in the 1930s, supported the idea of using the average labor time needed to produce goods as an accounting unit for a communist society. Paul Maddock and the American Council Communists supported and publicized these ideas. The major work on this subject, written by the Group of International Communists of Holland, GIC, and published in 1930, was called, quote, Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, end quote. The GIC was meticulous in assembling Marx and Engels' comments on the topic of communist society, and their ideas are seemingly an elaboration on Marx's brief comments in the critique of the Gotha program. In the GIC's schema, workers would receive certificates for the hours of labor they perform, and these would be redeemable, after certain deductions for general social services, for the amount of goods which, on average, took the same amount of time to produce. These certificates would not circulate like money, nor would they be used in relations between productive enterprises. Here is a passage from their book that describes this setup. Quote, the sole role of labor certificates is to function as the means to enable individual consumption in all its variety to be regulated according to the measure of labor time. A part of the total, quote, yield, end quote, of any individual unit of labor is, in the course of daily economic life, already consumed through the processes of socialized distribution, i.e., reproduction, whilst only a certain proportion of that total can make its way in the form of labor certificates into the hands of individual consumers and be expended in accordance with the production times stamped upon the separate consumption articles. We have already observed that the mass of labor certificates issued becomes continually smaller as the process of socialization of distribution proceeds, finally to reach a figure of nil. End quote. GIC, the Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution. This last sentence essentially refers to the passage to the higher phase of communism. Despite what Dauvé writes, the GIC very clearly opposed what Marx called, quote, wage labor, end quote, and advocated a classless society in which the workers collectively managed production and distribution. In the GIC proposal, the needs of society are to be ascertained through shop organizations and consumers' cooperatives, and there is to be no market. The GIC did not wish for workers to democratically manage independent enterprises which would exchange with each other, and were critical of Proudhon's influence on syndicalism in this regard. In their analysis, This sort of opposition to all centralized control would paradoxically lead to what they called, quote, state communism, end quote, as in the Soviet Union, as an economic necessity, since the workers would not have established centralized economic control from below. Quote, it is, of course, also possible that syndicalist tendencies may be present, with such a degree of strength that the attempt of the workers to assume their own administrative control over the industrial establishment is accompanied by attempts to retain the role of money as the medium of exchange. Were this to occur, the result could be nothing other than the establishment of a form of guild socialism, which in turn could only lead by another road to state communism, end quote. In an article on anarchism and the Spanish Revolution, the GIC writes, quote, the right of self-determination of the workers over the factories and enterprises on the one hand, and centralization of management of production on the other, are incompatible so long as the foundations of capitalism, money and commodity production, are not abolished, and a new mode of production, based on the social average labor time, substituted instead, end quote. Furthermore, the GIC directly challenged Marxist thinkers such as Kautsky, who they considered to advocate the persistence of capitalist economic categories. Quote, the point must be made at the outset that Kautsky speaks quite unreservedly about the, quote, prices, end quote, of products as these still have validity as if these still have validity under communism. Kautsky is, of course, entitled to keep faith with his own terminology since, as we have seen, quote, prices, end quote, continue to function in the Kautskyan brand of, quote, communism, end quote. In the same way as, for this, quote, Marxist, end quote, the category of value is attributed with everlasting life, and just as, under his, quote, communism, end quote, money also continues to function. In the same way, prices also are assured an eternal life. But what kind of communism is it in which the same economic categories continue to have validity as exist under capitalism? End quote. GIC, Fundamentals of Communist Production and Distribution. The GIC argued that in what they called a, quote, system of planned use value production, end quote, in which, quote, the relation of the producers to the social product is directly expressed, end quote, the computation of the labor time necessary to produce these use values, quote, has nothing to do with value, end quote. So, in what way were these enemies of the persistence of economic categories of capitalism advocating the rule of the law of value? Dauvé writes, quote, Pannekoek and his friends, bracket, the GIC, end bracket, were quite right to go back to value and its implications, but they were wrong to look for a rational accounting system in labor time. What they propose is in fact the rule of value, since value is nothing but the amount of social labor time necessary to produce a good, without the intervention of money. One may add that this was attacked by Marx in 1857 at the beginning of the Grundrisse, end quote. In a book on the history of the German communist left, Dauvé makes a similar claim, criticizing the GIC's book for preserving, quote, the value relation, the general equivalent, end quote, even while destroying its apparent forms, referring to the reader to Marx's critique of Proudhon. It must be pointed out, however, that value is not simply, quote, the amount of social labor time necessary to produce a good, end quote. This is merely the magnitude of value, the average amount of time it takes to produce some use value. In a communist society, in a communal economy, products do not take on the form of value to begin with. So in Marx's usage, what is being described is no longer a measure of value. Dauvé must say what he does, however, so that any measurement of average labor time can be classed as, quote, value, end quote, and therefore capitalist, without specifying how the social relations of a democratically planned economy are value relations in Marx's sense. Dauvé uses, quote, value, end quote, as a scare word, a way of justifying the ascription of, quote, capitalist, end quote, to counsel communist proposals without actually citing any compelling evidence that either one, the Marxian law of values should be said to operate in a democratically planned economy, or that two, the council communists advocate democratic planning only at the level of the enterprise. For example, Dauvé writes disapprovingly, quote, Pannekoek's Workers' Councils, the book, defines communism as a democratic system of bookkeeping and value accounting, end quote. For Dauvé, labor time accounting as such is constitutive of the law of value. Just a side note, that's something you see all the time in like communization people, is like labor time accounting or any type of accounting being like synonymous with capitalism, which is, in my mind, just like, well, how do you expect to coordinate a world communist society without saying how long things take to produce, where they need to be? Like communism is not, I don't understand how these like such people think that like communism has nothing to do with planning or account, which would entail some type of accounting. Like that's just like, it's turning communism into some sheer utopia. I don't know, sorry. Getting fired up. Pannekoek, of course, never defines communism in the manner described by Dauvé. Here are some relevant passages from Pannekoek. Quote, labor is a social process. Each enterprise is part of the productive body of society. The total social production is formed by their connection and collaboration. Like the cells that constitute the living organism, they cannot exist isolated and cut off from the body. So the organization of work inside the shop is only 1/2 of the task of the workers. Over it, a still more important task, stands the joining of the separate enterprises, their combination in a social organization, ... How will the quantities of labor spent and the quantities of product to which the worker is entitled be measured? In a society where the goods are produced directly for consumption, there is no market to exchange those goods and no value, as expression of the labor contained in them establishes itself automatically out of the processes of buying and selling. Here the labor spent must be expressed in a direct way by the number of hours. The administration keeps records, of the hours of labor contained in every piece or unit quantity of product, as well as of the hours spent by each of the workers. In the averages over all the workers of a factory, and finally, over all the factories of the same category, the personal differences are smoothed out and the personal results are intercompared, ... As a plain and intelligible numerical image, the process of production is laid open to everybody's views. Here mankind views and controls its own life. What the workers and their councils devise and plan in organized collaboration is shown in character and results in the figures of bookkeeping, only because they are perpetually before the eyes of every worker. The direction of social production by the producers themselves is rendered possible. End quote. Antonie Pannekoek. As we will see, Pannekoek's description of the transparency of the communist process of production is reminiscent of Marx's description of communism and capital. Marx decidedly does not identify, quote, the rule of value, end quote, with bookkeeping and conscious social control over the production process, but rather with the producer's subordination of the production process. According to Marx, quote, the concept, quote, value, end quote, presupposes, quote, exchanges, end quote, of the products. Where labor is communal, the relations of men in their social production do not manifest themselves as, quote, values, end quote, of, quote, things, end quote, end quote. It is nonetheless in this sort of society, as described by Pannekoek above, that Dauvé insists workers' councils would necessarily function like capitalist enterprises. Does Marx's argument in the Grundrisse support Dauvé's position as he suggests? The criticism of the labor time accounting of the GIC is made on the basis of Marx's value theory, although there is conveniently no mention made of Marx's comments in the critique of the Gotha program. If Marx actually rejected this sort of labor time accounting in the Grundrisse, this would seem to clash with his remarks in the critique of the Gotha program. Was Marx mistakenly advocating a return to capitalism in the critique of the Gotha program? Or did Marx not identify labor time accounting with capitalism and the law of value? The use of the labor certificates described by Marx would require some form of labor time accounting to keep track of the amount of time that it takes to produce various goods, both because this is necessary for a planned allocation of resources and also because the labor certificates are to be denominated in units of labor time. But why are such certificates advanced by Marx, instead of denounced as a utopian labor money scheme? In order to better understand how Marx understood these issues, we will look at his various writings on the subject of labor money schemes, as well as investigate how Marx employed his value theory in this context. Marx's critique of labor money. Marx's critique of labor money. Marx's critique of labor money is predicated on the idea that it cannot do what it is intended to do. He calls it a, quote, pseudo-economic term, end quote. That socialists would propose such an ineffective solution to the problems of capitalism suggested to Marx an inadequate understanding of the role of money in capitalist society. As early as 1844, in his notes on James Mill's Elements of Political Economy, Marx was developing a distinct theory of money within the framework of his understanding of human alienation. Marx views money as expressive of particular social relations, relations that have escaped genuine human control. He writes that, quote, the mediating movement of man engaged in exchange is not a social human movement. It is no human relationship. It is the abstract relation of private property to private property. And this abstract relation is the value which requires a real existence as value, only in the form of money, end quote. It is precisely this understanding of the genesis of money that Marx uses against Proudhon, when he exclaims, quote, "Money is not a thing, it is a social relation," end quote. This understanding of money is reaffirmed in the Grundrisse, where Marx writes that in money, quote, "individuals have alienated their own social relationship from themselves so that it takes the form of a thing," end quote. It is on this basis that Marx criticized the advocates of labor money, since the value form, and thus money, springs from the social relation of private exchange. Simply modifying the token used to effect this exchange cannot do away with the basic inadequacies of the capitalist mode of production. Marx explains that criticism is often directed at money and interest to the exclusion of the social basis of capitalism due to the fact that all of the irrationality of capitalism appears most forcefully in the money market. As Marx wrote in 1851, quote, "Since it is in the money market that the entire crisis erupts and all the features of bourgeois production recur as symptoms, which, it is true, become incidental causes, nothing is simpler to understand than the fact that it is money that narrow-minded reformers who stick to the bourgeois standpoint want to reform. Because they want to retain value in private exchange, they retain the division between the product and its exchangeability, but they want to modify the token of this division in such a way that it expresses identity." End quote. Marx's most extended treatment of these reformers is in the Grundrisse, where Marx criticizes the Proudhonist Damen and the Ricardian socialist John Gray. Those who proposed labor money sought to eliminate harmful or unjust aspects of capitalism, such as economic crises and unequal exchanges, such as the exchange between capital and labor. They imagined that a bank could identify prices with values through the use of labor money, tokens representing a certain number of labor hours, and that this could do away with the anarchic fluctuation of supply and demand in a capitalist monetary economy. Marx accused them of utopianism, wanting to establish socialism on the basis of commodity production. The labor theory of value was seen by Proudhon, for example, as a sort of program for justice to be realized. Marx's view is quite different. Quote, "I say, ... that commodity production is necessarily, at a certain point, turned into, quote, capitalist, end quote, commodity production, and that according to the law of value governing it, quote, surplus value, end quote, is properly due to the capitalist and not to the laborers," end quote. A key point in Marx's critique of the labor money proposals is that while value expresses the social character of labor under capitalism, value can only do so through a market price that is distinct from value. The, quote, time chitters, end quote, erroneously believe, Marx writes, quote, that by annulling the nominal difference between real value and market value, between exchange value and price, that is, by expressing value in units of labor time itself instead of in a given objectification of labor time, say gold and silver, that in doing so they also remove the real difference and contradiction between price and value, end quote. Marx holds that this proposed solution does not strike at the root of the contradiction, namely the lack of social control over production. Damen and other advocates of labor money wish to overturn the privileged role of precious metals in circulation and exchange. Marx characterizes Darimant's aim in the following manner, quote, "Let the Pope remain, but make everybody Pope. Abolish money by making every commodity money and by equipping that commodity with the specific attributes of money," end quote. Marx argues that commodities cannot directly represent their universal exchangeability in terms of labor time, but that the labor expended individually on a commodity must be represented as socially uniform labor through the medium of some universal equivalent or money. If labor money was used to abolish the special role of money in the economy, the value commanded by labor money in exchange would necessarily diverge from its nominal value in terms of labor time, and it could not affect the social equalization of diverse labors while simultaneously representing an equivalent amount of labor time for individual commodities. When one commodity is produced more efficiently than another of the same type, it commands the same amount of money on the market. However, if labor money were to exchange in equal quantities for these commodities, it could not at the same time represent a specific amount of labor time. The sort of organization of social production adequate to a society of commodity producers relies on the competitive dynamic of price movements. Also relevant in this connection is Marx's discussion of the simple form of value in Capital Volume 1, where he analyzes the relative and equivalent forms, whereby one commodity, in the relative form, expresses its value through the body of another commodity, in the equivalent form. Marx writes that these forms, quote, "exclude each other as polar opposites," end quote. This is significant insofar as the private labor expended on a commodity cannot directly represent social labor independently of the exchange relationship, and here only the commodity in the equivalent form, which expresses the value of the other commodity, represents social labor in its material form. The social relations of value production thus necessarily manifest themselves in the relation between two things, as the attribute of a thing, as an intrinsic property. Money is described as a general equivalent, a commodity through which all other commodities express their value. In Capital, Marx links his analysis of the form of value to his critique of Proudhon and the Ricardian socialists, once again using his Pope metaphor, quote, "It is by no means self-evident that the form of direct and universal exchangeability is an antagonistic form, as inseparable from its opposite, the form of non-direct exchangeability, as the positivity of one pole of a magnet is from the negativity of the other pole. This has allowed the illusion to arise that all commodities can simultaneously be imprinted with the stamp of direct exchangeability, in the same way that it might be imagined that all Catholics can be popes," end quote. Not only do the Catholics rely on their pope, but also the pope would not have his position if there were no Catholics. In the same way, the products of mutually indifferent producers cannot be socially distributed without money. Money would not exist if goods were not produced as commodities. The dual character of the commodity, discussed at the start of Capital, is foundational for Marx's treatment of money. The commodity is both a use value and a value because it is produced for exchange, rather than simply as an object of consumption for the producers. For the owner, the commodity represents a claim on a portion of the social product. Its social form as a value is evident in the way we act and the way we speak of commodities and their worth in a developed capitalist society. Only with the expansion of the market in the various branches of industry can the vast majority of goods be produced as commodities. The development of industry and the division of labor develops the social character of the commodity, the necessity for its evaluation against all the other goods on the market. According to Marx, the commodity as use value enters into contradiction with its character as an exchangeable value, in which capacity it is related to the whole world of commodities in various proportions. As a use value, the commodity is not divisible at will into the various proportions in which it might be exchangeable with the diverse commodities necessary for consumption and the maintenance of industry. The necessity of money is the necessity for an independent representation of value as such. Every commodity can thus be expressed as a component part of the total social product without being determined by the needs of the consumers. The claim on a portion of the social product represented by the commodity may or may not be realized on the market. Even if nothing but socially necessary labor time is expended on a commodity, it can still turn out that superfluous labor was expended if demand for a particular commodity is insufficient. The seller of the commodity supplies a use value and demands its exchange value. But the demand for the commodity is not determined by the value the seller wishes to realize in exchange. The buyer may not desire the quantity of use value supplied at the offered price. Insofar as supply and demand determine price fluctuations, prices of individual commodities, the monetary value the capitalist hopes to realize in exchange, will naturally diverge from commodity values determined by socially necessary labor time. In the section of the Grundrisse dealing with John Gray, Marx develops the contradictions inherent in his ideas about labor money. Starting out from the assumption of commodity production and assuming that a central bank issues labor money, Marx argues that the only way the vicissitudes of the market could be eliminated is if the bank became the, quote, general buyer and seller, but also the general producer, end quote. If private producers actually receive labor money in proportion to the labor time spent producing their goods, the regulative role of supply and demand would be annulled, leading to economic collapse, whereas, if the bank itself makes determinations of value, it comes to act as the real organizer of production. In other words, the bank would have to impose a despotic plan on an unplanned economy. Gray's goals can only be achieved in opposition to his premises. Marx also considers the social function of the despotic bank from the point of view of the common owner of the means of production. In fact, either it would be a despotic ruler of production and trustee of distribution, or it would indeed be nothing more than a board which keeps the books and accounts for society producing in common, end quote. Naturally, Marx favors the latter alternative. Marx claims that Gray assumes an economic foundation of private production instead of common society-wide control, but wishes to do away with the economic consequences of private production. The labor money system of equal exchange on the basis of commodity production carried to its logical conclusion of doing away with the evils of the monetary system necessitates leaving commodity production behind, just as commodity production necessitates the divergence of price from value and other things Gray dislikes. Marx's discussion of Gray's system in a contribution to the critique of political economy sheds light on the passage from the Grundrisse. Marx writes, quote, "On the one hand, society in the shape of the bank makes the individuals independent of the conditions of private exchange. And, on the other hand, it causes the individuals to continue to produce on the basis of private exchange. Although Gray merely wants to, quote, reform, end quote, the money evolved by commodity exchange, Gray is compelled by the intrinsic logic of the subject matter to repudiate one condition of bourgeois production after another, end quote. Marx. If this desire to try to solve the problems of capitalism by reforming the money system that Marx singles out is the essence of the labor money schemes, it is this desire to solve the problems of capitalism by reforming the money system that Marx singles out as the essence of the labor money schemes. In the Grundrisse, when Marx is criticizing Derrida, he summarizes the issue in this way, quote, the general question would be this: can the existing relations of production and the relations of distribution which correspond to them be revolutionized by a change in the instrument of circulation, in the organization of circulation, end quote. The proponents of the labor money schemes focused attention on the medium of exchange without understanding the underlying relations of production. As John Gray wrote, quote, a defective system of exchange is not one amongst many other evils of nearly equal importance. It is the evil, the disease, the stumbling block of the whole society, end quote. John Gray. Marx believed that the evils of bourgeois society, which the advocates of labor money aim to cure, such as the rising and falling of prices, are, quote, not to be remedied by, quote, transforming, end quote, the banks or by founding a rational, quote, money system, end quote, end quote. For Marx, it is utopian to, quote, wish to retain commodities but not money, production based on private exchange without the essential conditions for this type of production. End quote. Marx expressed these ideas in his critique of John Gray in the contribution to the critique of political economy. Quote, commodities are the direct products of isolated, independent, individual kinds of labor, and through their alienation in the course of individual exchange, they must prove that they are general social labor. In other words, on the basis of commodity production, labor becomes social labor only as a result of the universal alienation of individual kinds of labor. But as Gray presupposes that the labor time contained in commodities is immediately social labor time, he presupposes that it is communal labor time or labor time of directly associated individuals. In that case, it would indeed be impossible for a specific commodity, such as gold or silver, to confront other commodities as the incarnation of universal labor, and exchange value would not be turned into price. But neither would use value be turned into exchange value and the product into a commodity, and thus the very basis of bourgeois production would be abolished. But this is by no means what Gray had. Goods are to be produced as commodities, but not exchanged as commodities, ... But it was left to Monsieur Proudhon and his school to declare seriously that the degradation of money and the exaltation of commodities was the exaltation... But it was left to M. Proudhon and his school to declare seriously that the degradation of money and the exaltation of commodities was the essence of socialism, and thereby to reduce socialism to an elementary misunderstanding of the inevitable correlation existing between commodities and money. End quote. Marx. Money is simply a development of the relation between commodity and commodity. Hence the, quote, inevitable correlation existing between commodities and money, end quote. Marx believed that Ricardo in the classical political economy and classical political economy inadequately understood this connection. Marx's discussion of the value form in Capital, Volume 1, referred to above, is a detailed analysis of the connection between commodity and money, an analysis, quote, never even attempted by bourgeois economics, end quote. His thesis is that, quote, the money form of the commodity is only the further developed shape of the simple value form, i.e., of the expression of value of a commodity in any other commodity, end quote. That these products of labor are commodities in the first place rests on the premise that they are, quote, products of separate private labors carried on independently of one another, end quote, Marx. The social control and accounting undertaken by the associated producers in a communist society abolishes the value relation, and for this reason abolishes money, only by ignoring the specificity of Marx's critique of the labor-money schemes, and assuming that it is aimed at any system involving labor-time accounting, can Dauvé maintain that it is directly applicable to the ideas of the Council Communists. As we will see, Marx's scattered remarks on communist society strongly support this assessment. Marx on communism. As we have seen, for Marx, money is not simply a unit of measure, but presupposes private commodity owners confronting each other on the market. Money's social function is the mediation of the private labors of commodity producers. Given the premise of directly social labor, and this is the basis of Marx's first phase of communism, this social function of money is no longer necessary. The labor certificates have a different function, that of facilitating a conscious allocation of goods. Marx makes this distinction in a pertinent digression, in a footnote, on the socialist Robert Owen in Volume 1 of Capital. Quote, ... Owen's, quote, labor money, end quote, for instance, is no more, quote, money, end quote, than a theater ticket. Owen presupposes directly socialized labor, a form of production diametrically opposed to the production of commodities. The certificate of labor is merely evidence of the part taken by the individual in the common labor, and of his claim to a certain portion of the common product which has been set aside for consumption. But Owen never made the mistake of presupposing the production of commodities, while, at the same time, by juggling with money, trying to circumvent the necessary conditions of that form of production, end quote. We have already seen that what Marx had in mind when he refers to, quote, juggling with money, end quote. In the above passage, we see that Marx makes a clear distinction between the idea of a labor certificate functioning within the context of, quote, directly socialized labor, end quote, and the labor money of his theoretical adversaries. It is on the basis of this distinction that we can confidently say that Marx was not advocating the rule of value in the critique of the Gotha program, nor was he departing from his critique of utopian socialism. Further support for this position is provided by Marx's discussion in Capital of a self-sufficient, isolated producer, Robinson Crusoe. Marx writes that Robinson Crusoe, quote, soon begins, like a good Englishman, to keep a set of books. His stockbook contains a catalogue of the various objects he possesses, of the various operations necessary for their production, and finally of the labor time that specific quantities of these products have on average cost him. All the relations between Robinson and these objects that form his self-created wealth are here so simple and transparent that even Mr. Sedley Taylor could understand them. End quote. Significantly, here is the notion of a simplicity and transparency lacking in capitalist relations, where the law of value functions behind the backs of the producers. As Marx put it in Capital Volume 3, the law of value operates as a, quote, blind natural force vis-a-vis the individual agents, bracket, of capital, end bracket, end quote. This is precisely why the law of value would not be operative in the, quote, system of planned use value production, end quote, advocated by the Council Communists. What Marx then goes on to do in Capital Volume 1 is imagine production in a communist society as a sort of contrast to capitalism, utilizing the example of Robinson Crusoe. This discussion in particular parallels Marx's remarks about the first phase of communism in the critique of the Gotha program. Marx writes, quote, "Let us imagine, for a change, an association of free men, working with the means of production held in common, and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force." All the characteristics of Robinson's are repeated here, but with the difference that they are social instead of individual. All Robinson's products were exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and they were therefore directly objects of utility for him personally. The total product of our imagined association is a social product. One part of this product serves as fresh means of production and remains social. But another part is consumed by the members of the association as means of subsistence. This part must therefore be divided amongst them. The way this division is made will vary with the particular kind of social organization of production and the corresponding level of social development attained by the producers. We shall assume, but only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would in that case play a double part. Its apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the correct proportion between the different functions of labor and the various needs of the associations. On the other hand, labor time also serves as a measure of the part taken by each individual in the common labor, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers, both towards their labor and the products of their labor, are here transparent in their simplicity, in production as well as in distribution. End quote. Marx. Here Marx draws a parallel between the transparency of Robinson's relations with his products and the transparency of the social relations of communism. Marx in no way identifies the idea of labor certificates and labor time accounting being used in a communist society with the law of value. Far from identifying labor time accounting with the law of value, Marx argued in the Grundrisse that, quote, such an economy of time, end quote, increases in importance with the passage to communal production. Quote, on the basis of communal production, the determination of time remains, of course, essential. The less time the society requires to produce wheat, cattle, etc., the more time it wins for other production, material or mental. Just as in the case of an individual, the multiplicity of its development, its enjoyment, and its activity depends on economization of time. Economy of time, to this all economy ultimately reduces itself. Society likewise has to distribute its time in a purposeful way. in order to achieve a production adequate to its overall needs. Just as the individual has to distribute his time correctly in order to achieve knowledge in proper proportions, or in order to satisfy the various demands on his activity. Thus, economy of time, along with the planned distribution of labor time among the various branches of production, remains the first economic law on the basis of communal production. It becomes law, there, to an even higher degree. However, this is essentially different from a measurement of exchange values, labor or products, by labor time. End quote, Marx. Marx did not see this, quote, economy of time, end quote, as identical with the law of value, because the law of value most definitely does not represent any conscious measuring. This is the fundamental error in Dauvé's characterization of the group of international communists of Holland as advocating the rule of value. Conclusion. We have seen why Marx critiqued the labor money schemes from his own writings, as well as the importance that he placed on labor time accounting in a communist society. The critique of the communist, quote, management of the economy, end quote, is bankrupt, insofar as it relies on Marx's theory. And Dauvé offers no practical argumentation other than this. This critique pushes people away from seriously considering the question of the economic viability of a socialist society by encouraging glib dismissals of, quote, self-management, end quote, as embodying some sort of capitalist program. Furthermore, opposition to self-management obscures the fact that a new relation of the worker to work is in fact essential to socialism. If the critique of self-management was based on any evidence that the Council Communist advocated independent enterprise that exchanged with each other on the market, there would be some substance to it. As it is, Dauvé's use of the words, quote, wage labor, quote, law of value, and, quote, capitalism, is nothing more than an unfortunate rhetorical flourish. Thanks for listening.